Four Spheres of Knowledge Creation. The Causal Principles by René Holmbjerg Bøtker. Chapter 2. Philosophical Introduction. The problem with knowledge has always been to answer the question, how can we trust what we know? Although the question was present already in the pre-Socratic era of philosophy, the question was presented most famously in Plato's myth of the cave. In this myth, we see people imprisoned in a cave of experiences and illusions. The experiences and illusions represent the experienced reality in which the prisoners exist. The prisoners in Plato's myth are struggling not only to reach beyond their experiences and illusions, but also to accept the questioning and critique of these experiences and illusions. The struggle depicted is a representation of the desire to escape imprisonment, which is followed by the dependency of imprisonment for stability and control of ourselves and our environment. With the myth of the cave, Plato posed several philosophical questions of knowledge creation. It has even been said that nothing really happened in philosophy after Plato, that the question of how we get past our own individual presuppositions and find a truth that is eternal and universal is still valid and very open to answers. While it might not be completely correct that nothing happened after Plato, there is some truth to it. Plato's work laid the foundation for Aristotle and many Western philosophers to come. Plato's student Aristotle argued for an empirical approach to knowledge creation, where he presented the four causes of being: the material, the formal, the efficient, and the final cause. It was thought that if the questions of these four causes could be answered, we would know the true being of an object. The material cause answers the question of which material an object is made of. The formal cause refers to the identification of an object as a differentiated item, namely, in which form the material is represented. The efficient cause refers to the effect of an object, namely, what it does or what it can do, and in relation to whom or what. The final cause refers to the other causes coming together, thereby revealing the object as an individual object in the grand scheme of reality. I wish to add a small note on these causes, because they will become somewhat central to the framework presented in this book. The material cause will be the ontological framework of Leibniz. The formal cause will be the delineation of an object from other objects through shared boundaries. The efficient cause will be the definition of an object through interactions with other objects. The final cause will be an infinite pre-established harmony, which constitutes and governs interaction between objects as a foundation of causality. But more on that later. Here, as with other philosophical frameworks, we see the remnants of the ancient Greek philosophical tradition. One of the central remnants is the argument of whether knowledge should be either based on empirical experiences or rational thoughts. Seen vividly between Plato and Aristotle, the dichotomy between empiricism and rationalism saw its second uprising in the Enlightenment, where René Descartes presented his Cartesian dualism of mind and matter. This dualism, in many ways, started a discussion that gave rise to the principles on which we have structured our social systems. It is through these systems which we have learnt to absorb and create knowledge. Descartes. Descartes perceived science as a system of causal interrelations. The idea of a causal system comes from the philosophical idea of the principle of sufficient reason. Although Descartes did not explicitly use the principle of sufficient reason, I feel that it is necessary to explain the principle in relation to his work. The principle of sufficient reason states that for any event to happen, there must be a sufficient reason for it to happen. The proposition is that the world is not random. The world works as a system of causal interrelations, where the job of science is to understand this system of causal interrelations. Contrary to what most people think, the most difficult task of science is not to reach a conclusion for an argument. The main task for science is to prove that the premises of an argument are true. The problem lies within the fact that each premise is the conclusion of another argument, which in turn requires proof for its own premises. If we are to pursue this thought process, we run into the problem of an infinite regression. This infinite regression has proved to be perhaps the biggest obstacle for science. One of the primary objectives of philosophy of knowledge has been to find ways of dealing with the problem of infinite regression. One way to completely dismiss the idea of infinite regression would be to find a single point of certainty. If this could be done, infinite regression would no longer be a viable thought pattern, as a finite premise would be evident as this point of certainty. This would present an undoubtable premise which we could use to build our arguments and thereby explain how the world works as a system of interrelations. If this proof was possible, a system of scientific thought was possible, a system which would be indubitable. This problem was indeed the problem which Descartes believed that he had solved. René Descartes pursued a point of absolute certainty through a process called the Cartesian method of doubt. The conclusion of this method was the Latin phrase, cogito ergo sum. This phrase was famously translated into the phrase, I think, therefore I exist. Contrary to popular interpretation, this statement has little to do with existentialism or what it means to exist as a human being. Quite the contrary. The statement became the foundation of modern natural science. René Descartes reached the conclusion through a method of systematic doubt. This method was intended to answer the groups in the society who doubted natural science, namely, those who were skeptical, those who doubt. Descartes knew that you can never persuade another person through a methodology that the person does not subscribe to. Therefore, to create a foundation for science, which those who doubt could not doubt, Descartes applied a methodology of doubt to eliminate the doubt of those who doubt. The interesting thing about people who doubt is that there is a reason why they doubt, and they believe in this reason, i.e., there must be arguments for why they doubt, and they do not doubt these arguments. The basic idea of an argument inherently contains a belief in a form of logic. To answer the skeptics, Descartes' inquiry began with a reference to Plato, namely, that there are two worlds, a world of experience and a world of thought. Since these are the only two worlds, the point of certainty had to exist within these two worlds. In any inquiry, the most intuitive approach is to start with what is right in front of us. Descartes did just that. He asked whether there is any certainty in our direct experience. Descartes presented the example of a stick protruding through the surface of water. The human eye sees a bend in the stick. This is, of course, an optical illusion. The example illustrates the lack of certainty in our sensory experience. Descartes had, in a relatively simple manner, dismissed the possibility of certainty in our sensory experiences. To dismiss experiences, and thereby empiricism altogether, he had to rephrase the question to not only ask if we can trust our experiences, but to ask whether or not we are even having an experience. This is not only a question of whether we can trust the experience of the stick, but whether the stick even exists. Optical illusion or not. The question is, if there even is a stick. His answer was to reference the vividness of a dream, an example which have been the source of much fiction ever since. Dreams seem real when we're in them. We have no reason to believe that the experienced reality is not a dream. The fact that dreams are vivid dismisses the certainty of experience. If we are to apply doubt in the strictest sense of the word, our experience must be dismissed if there is even the smallest possibility of these experiences being false. This concluded the first half of his inquiry, and the result was that everything related to experience must be dismissed as a source of certainty. There is no way to trust it. Therefore, any point of certainty must lie outside of our experience. Utilizing the same method of doubt on thoughts, he posed the question, can we trust our thoughts? His answer was sadly once again, no. As many politicians are much too aware, the human mind is an easy thing to manipulate. Descartes was also aware of this issue, and he argued that we would never know whether there was a malign demon who was manipulating our thoughts. Therefore, we had to dismiss our thoughts as a source of certainty. Having dismissed our experience and the first inquiry into our thoughts, he applied the same method to thoughts as he did to experience. He posed the question of whether a thought was there. Whether our thoughts are true or false, the question is, are we even thinking? The answer to the question was relatively simple. If we doubt whether we're thinking about whether we're thinking or not. To doubt whether we're thinking or not is a paradox, as the activity of doubt inherently is based on thinking. Therefore, if we doubt, it must be true that we're thinking. This is a truth which cannot be denied, as the very act of denial proves it. Thinking itself was Descartes' point of certainty. I think, therefore I exist. After dismantling the entire world and destroying all but one point of certainty, his job was now to create a structure for scientific development as a systematic endeavor. A structure where all causal relations are accounted for. A structure that would validate science for those who doubt it, whether it be governments, religious authorities, or the general public. The primary inquiry in science is causality. Therefore, to find a structure of science, we must find out what causality is dependent on. As thought is our point of certainty and the only thing which we can trust to be in existence, Descartes argued that this is where we must start. In Descartes' proposal, causal interrelation is dependent upon an intelligent mental system. This mental system is what in most cultures and religions is known as God. God as the spirit, the mentality that enable things to happen. God as causality. A point to be made here is that this is not in any way a religious approach to philosophy. It is merely the fact that there is something in the world that enables things to happen. Today, we call it logic. The fact that we believe in mathematical logic as the single source of causality is what we inherited from Descartes. We inherited the idea that mathematical logic is the source of science as the mental system that allows causal interrelations. Descartes had found the basis of causality in the mental world. He now had to prove how we could deduce anything about the material world from a system of thought. Since the mental world protrudes through into the material world, there must be something in the material world which we can investigate to understand the intelligence behind it. Descartes argued that there is one thing that material causal interaction is dependent on. The answer lies in the definition, namely material. There needs to be matter, and the one thing that enables us to experience matter is extension. To Descartes, extension is the one thing that crosses the boundary between mind and matter. Extension is represented in the material world and as the foundation for a theoretical geometric system. Any material object and its movement can be visualized through analytical geometry as a mathematical proposition based on objects extended in space. Indeed, one of the most seminal frameworks in mathematics is the Cartesian coordinate system and the analytical geometry that follows it. With his work in mathematics, Descartes revolutionized our way of working with mathematical equations, and with his work in philosophy, Descartes legitimized the field of science by enabling mathematics to be accepted as a representation of the intelligence of God and the foundation of causal interrelations. Leibniz. After Descartes, it was widely accepted that the intelligent system behind causal interrelation is mathematical. Through an understanding of mathematics, we can understand why material causality happens. Mathematics is the source of enlightenment, but the question that arose with the invention of differential calculus was as to whether we should follow mathematics, regardless of whether our perception of the material reality agreed with it. Leibniz invented differential calculus at the same time as Isaac Newton, and there was and still is a controversy as to who was the father of differential calculus. Unlike Newton, Leibniz was a rationalist who believed that mathematical developments had precedence over our experience of the material world. Where Newton believed that differential calculus was merely a tool for understanding and approximating events unfolding in space and time, Leibniz believed that differential calculus gave us an insight into how the world really worked. The principle of differential calculus is to differentiate a geometric curve or object into an infinite number of points. In his philosophical work, Leibniz applied this principle to the understanding of the material world. Imagine a line with two ends. If we were to take away 50% of the line, we would have 50% of the line left. Now imagine we do that procedure again with one of the remaining pieces of 50%. Again, we would be left with 50%. Now, imagine a scenario where we continue the process of removing 50% until we reach a point where the remaining part cannot be divided. This becomes a rather difficult task, as the line will never reach a singular point. It will always be subject to division. What we see in this thought experiment is that the pursuit of a remaining part that cannot be divided is impossible, as the remaining part will always be divisible. With this thought experiment, Leibniz showed that if the foundation of something material is extension, anything material will always be a complex composite made up of more than one component. The implication of this argument is radical, namely that the substance, which is singular and indivisible, is immaterial. With this argument, Leibniz gave an answer to Aristotle's first cause, the material cause, the question of what an object is made of. The argument became the foundation of a perception of a world consisting of an unlimited amount of intelligent, immaterial, indivisible particles. Monads was the name which Leibniz used to express these immaterial particles. According to Leibniz, monads come together in composites to create matter in a process of interaction. The interaction is performed through expression and perception. When one monad perceives the expression of another monad, the representation of the perceived monad becomes real in the universe of the perceiving monad. Leibniz argued that each monad was an entire universe in itself. In this universe, everything that ever could happen already exists. This, in turn, meant that there are as many universes as there are monads. All of these universes combines to make up a divine pre-established harmony of interaction. In this pre-established harmony of interaction, every monad has free will within their own universe, but is subjected to the pre-established harmony. God exists as the accumulation of every monad and is a representation of the interactions, which allows every object to emerge as an eternal pre-established harmony. He thereby gives an answer to Aristotle's second, third, and fourth causes: the formal, the efficient, and the final. The formal cause is the extension based on the shared boundary between a perceiving and expressing monad. The efficient cause is the interaction between the perceiving and expressing monad. The final cause as the pre-established harmony, which allows interaction, and thereby the emergence of all phenomenal objects. For the reader with an interest in contemporary physics, the ideas of Leibniz should sound familiar. Many of the propositions from Leibniz's theories is present in both quantum mechanics and other contemporary frameworks of physics. In this book, the reader will also experience topics that are hard to distinguish from contemporary topics in physics, i.e. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, Schrödinger's cat, quantum entanglement, etc. As I am not a physicist, I cannot go into details with the theories. Furthermore, I won't for the very same reason I am mentioning them. Namely that the topics presented in this book are based on Leibniz, among others, and are to be interpreted as such. The topics are not representations of their contemporary resembling topics in physics. That being said, the topics resemble contemporary physics to a very large degree. To such a degree that Leibniz perhaps should be considered the father of quantum mechanics. However, this is not so, and perhaps the reason lies in the reception of the theories by his contemporaries. For the 18th century academic community, the theory of multiple universes, immaterial particles, and perception-dependent material existence was too extreme to consider as even remotely possible. Leibniz was to some extent forced, either by himself or others, to publish works that were specifically made for the public and works of a more stringent philosophical quality. The works which were directed at the public often consisted of crude arguments and persuasive, agreeable prose that was easy to understand and not in conflict with the normative environment in which he lived. One of the clearest examples of this was when he argued for the existence of free will. According to Leibniz, God would not create an imperfect world, and a world with free will and evil was better than a world with no free will. While this argument can receive some sentiment, there is little logical coherency within it. In his more logical work, we see the argument for free will as an argument for the freedom of an individual monad to act in its own universe. Every monad consists of an entire universe in itself. Reality, therefore, consists of an infinite number of universes, and every monad is free to act within its own universe. A much more logical proposition, but also a proposition which could be perceived as foolish or even blasphemy at the time. A proposition which could bear considerable consequences in his time. Leibniz never published the full magnitude of his thoughts. Whether it was because of the risk of persecution or ridicule, the public never received full insight into his theories. At the same time, Newton was storming the field of natural science with his work, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica. Newton opted to present a theory of objects in absolute space and time. Instead of following mathematics as a rationalist, Newton chose empiricism. Newton won the favor of the public, and his theories became the cornerstones of classical physics. What followed was an empirical revolution that swept through the academic communities, starting with Newton's friend John Locke. Locke. What if the mathematical system fails in the face of our experiences of the material world? Should we still believe it? For the rationalists, the answer is most definitely yes. If mathematics shows something that does not align with our experience of the material world, then surely we must doubt our experience. For the empiricists, the answer was quite the opposite. We must always take our experience of the material world as the source of certainty. What about optical illusions and the likes, you ask? Descartes just proved that we could not trust our experience. The philosopher John Locke had an answer to this. Locke, who is often viewed as a political philosopher, founded these political thoughts in an epistemological system of empirical knowledge development. Locke was indeed very inspired by Descartes. Along with his friend Isaac Newton, Locke completely agreed that mathematics could be used to describe the causal interrelations in the world. However, this was also all there was to it. Namely, description. Mathematics, for the empiricists, is a descriptive system, and if the experience does not align with the mathematics, the math is wrong. However, he was very aware that illusions existed, and to solve this problem, he divided the components of an experience into two qualities: primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are the qualities that can be expressed mathematically as units: length, width, height, distance, weight, etc. These elements can be measured through units that exist outside of our interpretation as standardized units. Whether it be the metric, imperial, or other systems of measurement, if we share the standard, we can be certain that it is not an illusion of the individual. Therefore, any experience that is accurately represented through a mathematical proposition using a standardized system of measurement will be replicable as an experiment. The problem for science occurs when we substitute primary qualities with secondary qualities. The secondary qualities are our individual perspectives, which are not measurable. Opinions such as taste, color, sounds that are not represented as standardized units, at least not with the methods available at the time of Locke. Though these play an immensely important part of the human experience, they are points of inquiry for the existentialists, not the scientists of Locke's day. Hume. Science is more than just the measurement of primary qualities. It is about understanding the dynamics of the natural world. For this purpose, we need more than an agreement of measurements and units. We need a tool for understanding the interrelation of interaction and predicting outcomes. We need statistics. At the most basic, there are two statistical tools that we can use to create predictions and forecasts. These are time series and causal models. Either we expect something to happen on account of the number of times that it has happened before, or we expect it to happen as an effect from a cause. Contrary to common sense and the use of statistics in science, Hume made it clear that statistics can do nothing for science as a source of accurate prediction. This was the insight that was shared by the philosopher David Hume. There is no logical reason to believe that something will happen on account of the number of times we have seen it happen before. Neither is there any reason to believe in any necessary connections between events unfolding in the material world. The question that arises is as to what happens to science when there is no certainty in the tools that we use to analyze the events that are unfolding. For Hume, the problem was not so much science itself, but the notion of what we expect science to be able to do for us. If we do science to find truth, we are on a hopeless quest. Truth will never come from the tools we have at our disposal. On the other hand, if we do science for social purposes, we can cure diseases, create technology, and generate value in social contexts. The thing is that science has never provided truth. Science is, and forever will be, about value creation unless we realize other methodologies. This idea of science being a social endeavor goes deeper than the application of science. When we examine the outcomes of science, we realize that indeed it can create value. The question is as to whether it is a depiction of nature or a depiction of how we as human beings perceive nature. Hume believed the latter, that the outcomes of science do not depict nature. Science shows us how human beings perceive the world. The philosopher Immanuel Kant remarked on his reading of Hume that he was awakened from his dogmatic slumber. Kant. The idea that humans depict the world in a certain way was fascinating for Kant, as it meant that there was a possibility of understanding not only how we depict the world, but also the limits of the human experience. We could find the border between the inside of Plato's cave and the outside of Plato's cave. By finding this border, we might also be able to understand what belongs in the world of human depiction and what cannot be depicted in the human world. The most important aspect of Kant's theories of knowledge has become known as Kant's Copernican revolution. This revolution may perhaps be the most important turning point in epistemology, philosophy, and social science in general. Kant's Copernican revolution has shaped our social and natural sciences like few other theoretical propositions. The original Copernican revolution, by Nicolaus Copernicus, was a change in the perception of the solar system. Before the original Copernican revolution, we thought of the Earth as the center of the solar system. After the original Copernican revolution, we thought of the Sun as the center of the solar system. Kant's Copernican revolution changed the way we perceive knowledge in much the same way. Before Kant, we thought that experience consisted of the world presenting itself to the perception of the human being. After Kant's Copernican revolution, we think of experience as the human being shaping the world through perception. Kant called this perceived reality the phenomenal world. That which could not be perceived in the phenomenal world, he called the noumenal world, the world outside of our grasp. Kant's Copernican revolution sparked a new understanding of knowledge development, namely, the idea that the human being plays an integral role in the way that the world is experienced and in extent constructed. The idea that we as human beings construct our own reality. The consequence of this idea is that anything that a human being will ever experience will be through a construction of reality as objects in time and space. Kant's Copernican revolution left us with three fundamental perceptions of knowledge development: rationalism, empiricism, and constructivism. The great system builders. It is almost like we have on a pair of glasses that shapes our reality as objects in space and time. A pair of glasses we can never take off. Or, can we? This was the job which Schopenhauer and Hegel took upon themselves: to transcend the experienced world of objects in time and space and understand a reality beyond human experience. To transcend the phenomenal world and understand the noumenal world. To understand the thing in itself or the thing for itself. Schopenhauer and Hegel lived at the same time and taught at the same university. Hegel was the older professor. He was admired and celebrated in his lifetime for his works by most scholars, except for Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer hated Hegel with a passion that has rarely been more vivid. He continuously criticized Hegel. He ridiculed him publicly and even placed his own lectures at the same time as Hegel in an attempt to leave Hegel in an empty auditorium. An attempt that, as the story goes, backfired spectacularly when no one showed up for Schopenhauer's lectures. The real question to ask is why he hated Hegel with such a passion. The answer is to be found in their approach to transcending human constructivism. Schopenhauer and Hegel represent perhaps the two most extreme versions of empiricism and rationalism, where both are trying to transcend the constructivist phenomenal world in search of truth. Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer represented empiricism. As an admirer of Locke, he believed that experience is essential to understanding both the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. Rationalism, on the other hand, would lead us into a world of illusions. However, as both Hume and Kant argued, empiricism suffered from the problematic fact that all experience is phenomenal and happens through an interpretation which our senses and mental faculties impose on the event that is being experienced. The method of transcending, therefore, meant that we had to experience without the interpretation that is imposed by our senses or mental faculties. In the book, The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer proposes a solution to the problem of experience by envisioning the world in a way that differed dramatically to the worldview that Newton had presented. The worldview presented by Schopenhauer is to be found in the title, The World as Will and Representation. The will is the noumenal world, and the phenomenal world exists for human being as an analog representation of the will. To understand the meaning of this, it is helpful to look towards one of Schopenhauer's greatest admirers, the physicist Albert Einstein. To some extent, Einstein's formula, E equals mc squared, is a rewrite of the title, The World as Will and Representation. Energy as the will, which is represented as matter. To understand Schopenhauer is to understand the noumenal world as a form of energy, which is represented to human beings as the phenomenal world. Schopenhauer argued that if we as human beings differentiate something into objects, then whatever we differentiate must be undifferentiated. Anything that is undifferentiated can only be the whole. Something that just is, without a beginning or an end. Something undifferentiated, yet complete. Schopenhauer never used the word energy to refer to the will, but there are so many similarities between the two concepts that it is helpful to think of will as energy. Schopenhauer argued that the source of causality is the will. When an event takes place, it does so because the will enables it. The will is not only inside objects as an energy. It is the very foundation of the material objects and that which allows an interaction to happen. Though the connotations of will indicates an intention, Schopenhauer is very clear on the fact that where there is no differentiation, there can be no intention. Intention is something that only exists in the constructed experience of the phenomenal world. To understand the will is to understand unintentional causality. It is to understand how the world works, beyond our interpretation. The method of transcending, therefore, requires an insight into the will. However, the problem is that when we observe the phenomenal world, we cannot see the will that exists in objects. We only see a human-constructed interpretation of the event. We only see correlation, not causality. Schopenhauer had a revolutionary argument. If the will is undifferentiated in the whole, then whatever is represented must give us insight into the whole and the will. Therefore, an insight into anything in the phenomenal world will give us an insight into the will as a whole. There is one thing in the world that we have experience of from the inside, which gives us access to the will. This is the human body. The human body is an object like any other object, and it is the same undifferentiated will that exists in the human body as the undifferentiated will that exists in any other object. This argument was radical, not because it emanated some sort of spirituality, which was not the intent of Schopenhauer, but because it meant that the most extreme version of empiricism was not about extrospection, but introspection. The most extreme version of empiricism was not about the experience of objects external to the human being, but the internal experience of the will that emerges through the human body as a physical object. The empirical transcendence over to the noumenal reality was not to be found through perception of interaction in the material world. It was to be found through letting go of these perceptions and experience our own body without the constructed interpretation through senses or mental faculties. While this radical new idea was incredibly interesting, it possessed a fundamental problem if we are to structure any organization around it. Namely, that if reality is undifferentiated, it cannot be conceptualized. Since words are representations of objects as a language of denotation, any communication-based organization of knowledge is insufficient. Therefore, any attempt of collaboration based on communication is futile. The only way for Schopenhauer to represent the will is through expressions of causality. Will can be observed momentarily as a spatial representation if a human can express the will through the production of an art as an exact representation of the will. Nevertheless, it will never be subject to conceptual understanding. True art does not have intention, but it affects and interacts with anything and everything as a spatial representation of will. Art is perfection, as the universality in beauty and horror. Art is grace. The ability to create these artistic productions was reserved to a select few. These are the geniuses who have the ability to let go of all ego and any sense of self. The genius who can transcend the phenomenal world and represent the noumenal world. Hegel. Although Hegel did not respond directly to Schopenhauer, he did comment on the character, which Schopenhauer described as an artistic genius. Hegel didn't completely dismiss the idea of the artistic genius. However, he did argue that the artistic ability was incredibly rare. When the experiencer becomes self-aware, the type of knowledge changes to a form where the experiencer evaluates knowledge based on his or her own experiences. Hegel explained that this was the hallmark of the skeptic. The skeptic is an empiricist whose measurement of truth is his or her personal experience of the phenomenal world. The skeptic builds an image of an object through the relations the object has with other objects in his or her experience. This image becomes a negative where the object is not experienced but exists as a void that is shaped by relations. These relations are central to the problematic nature of the skeptic. The relations are based on the interactions which an individual has had with the object in question. As such, it is a particular experience of a subject which lays the foundation of the negative void. Only through time and the relations which an object has with an eternal reality can the issue of a constructed phenomenal experience be transcended according to Hegel. Once we understand all possible relations that an object can have with other objects, the issue of negativity is no longer problematic. The void is defined comprehensively through all possible relations and is therefore representative as a noumenal object. Much like Schopenhauer's book, The World as Will and Representation, Hegel's framework can be understood from the title, The Phenomenology of Spirit. Spirit in this framework is to be understood as the logical framework that enables phenomena to happen, much like Schopenhauer's will or Leibniz's pre-established harmony. On this point, they are not in total disagreement. However, where Schopenhauer followed a monistic thought pattern as a legacy from Spinoza, Hegel followed the pluralistic thoughts of Leibniz. Leibniz argued that divine insight was a product of understanding the universe of all monads. The aggregation of all monads represents the pre-established harmony that allows interactions between objects. To understand the universe of a monad, therefore, is to understand its possibilities for interacting with other objects. Therefore, if we understand every possible interaction that an object can have, we can understand the universe of the monad which formed the basis for that object. We can understand the pre-established harmony if we understand all possible interactions. This is because the process will allow us to have a full understanding of the phenomenal world as an analog plural differentiated representation of the noumenal world. Hegel argued that if we were to understand an object as it is experienced in all interactions and thereby relations, we would then be able to understand the object as it exists in an objective noumenal reality. This would allow the object to separate itself from existence inside a subjective reality and position itself on its own in the totality that is reality. What would be left is the thing for itself. This is the real, without the illusions of the individual. The spirit is the rationality that exists in everything that is real, and the real is a representation of the rationality of the spirit. Descartes argued, experiences are subject to wrongful interpretations. We do experience illusions, which are not real nor rational. Illusions, which we must dismiss on account of this irrationality. The dismissal of irrational illusions was to become the key to transcendental insight for Hegel. According to Hegel, we understand what is right and rational through what is wrong and irrational. The movement towards rationality occurs when the skeptic is confronted with the illusions of his or her particular experience reality in an interaction with another particular experience reality. This interaction takes place through the experience of conflicts. Conflicts portrays the irrationality of illusions. We merge individual particular realities and take a step closer to understanding the rational objectivity of spirit when we accept that our perspective is irrational. We overcome conflicts by merging our own particular reality with the particular realm of others. We exchange experiences, ideas, and everything we have amassed through our life. We exchange our property. Over time, perspectives become more and more refined and defined through the exchange of property, and we inch closer and closer towards understanding a reality where all conflicts have been resolved. We move towards a rational, eternal understanding of the world. This process is the process of history. The process is known as the dialectic process and consists of 3 stages. Stage 1 is the thesis. The thesis is a situation where a particular understanding dictates the relations. Stage 2 is the antithesis, where the conflicts are revealed in a confrontation with another particular understanding through an exchange of property. Stage 3 is the synthesis, where the thesis and antithesis are merged and both particular realms synthesize to create a new particular understanding as a new thesis. And so the process repeats itself. When all the confrontations between perspectives have happened and all conflicts are resolved, we will have a full insight into the rational structures of phenomena in relation to an objective reality. Schopenhauer refused to believe that any objective reality could be reached. He believed that merging one illusion with another illusion would just create more illusions. He believed that we would become engulfed in a normative environment of illusions based on the political ability of an individual to persuade others of their personal insights. Schopenhauer even accused Hegel of just that when he called him a windbag and a charlatan. Although Schopenhauer did not clearly explain this, the outcome has been interpreted by many as a situation where the most skilled in political debate would reach a position at the top of a totalitarian hierarchy. Indeed, that is also how many have understood Hegel ever since, as a supporter of totalitarian social structures. Through a thorough reading of Hegel, it becomes clear that this is not the case. Hegel was in no way a supporter of totalitarian hierarchies. Hegel argued in his book, Philosophy of Rights, that the portrayed social structure would be totalitarian if the social structure was not founded on an external source of validity in either science or religion. Like John Locke's thoughts on primary and secondary qualities, we need a measuring stick, a standard which we could agree upon. The standard in social structures is the external source of validity. The external source of validity works to avoid totalitarianism by being the language through which we resolve our conflicts. In relation to science, the language is the specific scientific methodology which has been applied in the given scientific field of study. By building the scientific community with a methodology as an external source of validation, anyone can confront another individual by exposing methodological conflicts. Because the other individual also believes in the same methodological principles, he or she is required to accept the irrationality in his or her scientific discovery if it presents a conflict which is methodologically evident. This allows anyone to reach a higher position in the social hierarchy by applying the correct scientific methodologies. Whoever is at the top of the hierarchy will be there as an outcome of a shared rule set. A rule set which everyone in the hierarchy believes in. If mathematics is the methodology of choice, this would mean that if the mathematics does not concur with the experiment, then it is either a logical flaw in our reasoning or problems with the experiment. Either way, as a rationalist, the mathematics is never wrong and will always align with reality. The real is the rational and the rational is the real. The last great system builders. Where Hegel represented the most extreme form of rationalism, Schopenhauer represented the most extreme form of empiricism. Hegel and Schopenhauer were to become the last great system builders in philosophy. The last philosophers who dealt with understanding everything as an entirety. Since then, all we have seen is fragmentation. Sociology, linguistics, psychology, and other aspects of the theory of knowledge, each individually presented as separate from each other. As such, many of the developments in these fields owe their origins to the theoretical systems of Schopenhauer and Hegel. They have since segregated and grown outside of the scope of what once was. The frameworks have become reimagined and rephrased according to internal coherence and lost its position in the grand scheme of things. The arguments, which was once situated in a coherent environment, has proven difficult to understand when confronted with the multitude of contemporary social science. Whether it be psychological, sociological, or causal explanations, the application of diverse premises has left the field of knowledge creation in a somewhat confused state. Although both Schopenhauer and Hegel was guilty of this same thing, their adherence to a grand narrative meant that the coherency was still intact, albeit as a fragmented representation. This book presents knowledge creation as a result of causal structures to clarify the understanding of the causal principles of knowledge creation.